Hey, thanks for joining me today, guys. We've got the new Fujifilm X-T4 here, and today I'm going to give you my initial impressions on the X-T4 and also see how it compares with my trusty less than 2-year-old X-T3. I took some notes when I first took the X-T4 out of the box, and I'll share some of those initial thoughts with you and observations and how I think it compares to the X-T3, which has been my main landscape camera since its release in the fall of 2018. This video is not really meant to be a full review, but hopefully it can be of some value for those of you thinking about either of these two cameras as a first Fuji, or for those of you thinking of upgrading your existing X-T3 and are maybe still on the borderline. Of course, we'll cover some of the obvious changes like the new flip screen and the IBIS, but I think it's also a good idea to see what a relatively long-term X-T3 user notices different about the X-T4. So let's get started. Let me first start off by saying that I shoot primarily landscapes, probably about 98% landscape photography, with maybe a little bit of street photography mixed in, as well as some family snapshots. So mostly landscape photography. When we're talking about video, I shoot a very small amount of video, mainly just for my YouTube channel here. So just basic videos that you'll see on my channel. So anything that I say about video, please do take with a grain of salt. So with that said, let's go into the handling and the buttons and dials on the Fujifilm X-T4. The first thing I noticed when I took the camera out of the box was the increase in the grip size. This change was a necessity to accommodate the new battery, which is larger. The X-T4 grip feels deeper and more substantial when compared to the X-T3. Even if you don't have bigger hands, I think you might still appreciate it as it feels more secure and comfortable to hold when compared to the X-T3. It's still not a large grip compared to some other mirrorless cameras, and some may still find it lacking, but again, compared to the X-T3, it is a welcome change without moving too far away from the fun, compact form factor of previous XT cameras. Moving on to the weight, the new battery, which we'll touch on a little later, forces the bigger grip. So we have that bigger grip, a bigger battery, and the inclusion of IBIS, which means a slightly chunkier and heavier body overall. The X-T4 comes in at 607 grams with the battery versus the X-T3 coming in at 539 grams. While the difference is felt side by side and going back and forth between the cameras, I feel that I could get used to it and mostly forget about it with regular use. Let's talk a little bit about the famous dials that Fuji is known for. The ISO dial, shutter dial, and exposure compensation dial are all in the same place, and they all feel the same, with the exception of the shutter dial, which feels and sounds just a bit more clicky than the X-T3, which is a bit more dampened. The drive dial and what used to be the photometry or metering style and is now the still and movie mode dial are now a little bit bigger in diameter, which makes handling just that little bit easier on the X-T4. The still movie dial is going to be very helpful for hybrid shooters, as you can now switch back and forth between the two modes and still be able to retain your settings for each mode. It's a very nice feature. The drive dial now also has an HDR setting, which you can use when you have the drive mode set to HDR and you release the shutter. The X-T4 will take 3 shots auto bracketed to preserve as much detail as it can in the highlights and the shadows. You'll have options to set it to auto, 200, 400, 800, and 800% plus. The manual doesn't really say exactly what's going on with each setting, but I'm guessing that the higher the value, the further apart the difference is for the 3 exposures. Once the photo is taken, it's stored as a single raw file. Moving on to the ISO dial. The ISO dial used to have the L and H options for the extended low and high ISO, but those are now gone on the X-T4. The ISO dial now has a C for command, which is new. This allows you to control ISO with the front command dial, and you don't need to dive into the menu to be able to customize this anymore. Speaking of the command dials, the front dial feels about the same when spinning it, but the rear dial does feel much better than the X-T3's rear dial. The X-T4's rear dial sticks out just a little bit more, where the X-T3's is a little bit more recessed, which made accidentally clicking in on the function button of the rear dial more of an occurrence than you would like. With the X-T4, I now feel like I can change the shutter speed with more confidence without accidentally engaging that click-in option for that rear dial. I know some of these things like the rear dial and the way it spins and the ease at which it spins seems like maybe just a minor annoyance, but when you're out in the field, it does make a little bit of difference to your experience. You really don't want to be accidentally changing functions when you're out there and maybe messing something up when you accidentally changed something and you didn't want to. And that's why I'm going over some of these things, because I feel like the improvement on the XT4 is going to be minor for that area, but those minor differences are going to build up for a better experience out in the field. That rear dial on the XT3 and accidentally clicking it in really was an annoyance for me when I first switched from a DSLR to the XT3, and I'm really glad that they changed that on the XT4. Okay, so let's move on to the sides of the body now. With the sides of the body, you'll notice first that the remote port is now gone from the right side and is moved over to the left side next to the mic jack. This might be an issue if you're planning to use an L bracket with the XT4. Still on the right side are the SD card slots, both still UHS 2, but now you can simultaneously record video to both slots, which will be very valuable to pro video shooters. The headphone jack of the XT3 is now gone. You need to use a USB-C dongle now if you want to monitor your in-camera audio, which Fuji does supply in the box of your new XT4. The XT4 still has a USB-C and micro HDMI port, but with a separate door. So 2 doors now on the XT4 versus 1 on the XT3, and these are now sort of floppy rubber doors on the left side instead of the harder plastic found on the XT3. Moving to the back buttons, we now see the layout on the XT4 has shifted. Everything has moved one spot clockwise, as you see here. AFL is now called AE on. These buttons are of course still customizable, so if you don't like how they're set here on the XT4, you can just change them back to what you're used to on the XT3 or other Fuji camera. The top function button is no longer labeled and its position has changed too. To me, this position is improved, but it's still not the easiest button to access as the exposure comp dial still gets in the way. Now we move on to maybe the most controversial upgrade or update of the Fujifilm XT4, and that is the fully articulating flip screen. A lot of people asked for this and Fuji delivered. I emphasized a lot of people asked for it, but not all. I am one that really likes the tilt screen from the XT3, and it worked perfectly for getting those low-angled shots in both the horizontal and vertical positions, and some option for shooting above your head. But I know there are some pros and cons to both. The new screen makes it super easy to film yourself, which is perfect for vloggers and selfie lovers. Now there is a workaround to filming yourself with the XT3 using this contraption here, which actually works very well. I'll leave a link below for it, but the XT4's flip screen means one less thing to carry around. Those above the headshots are now even easier, as you can point the screen straight down instead of being limited by the angle of the XT3 screen. I can see this being very helpful with stills and video when trying to shoot over objects or people. Portrait shots down low are going to be a breeze if you're going to do a lot of those. For those filming video, you have all those angles the still shooter has, and you can now flip it around to face you or to the side for those tracking shots. You can track your subject while walking forward instead of backwards, which seems to be safer, especially if you're moving quickly and don't want to run into things, and can help smooth out your footage. If you're really used to having a fully articulating screen, you'll for sure be happy with the XT4, but for those of you more familiar with that tilt screen on the XT3 or another camera, it is something to think about. Speed for me is one thing, seems like a small issue, but flipping the screen out for a low shot or shooting from the hip for you street shooters is so simple with the tilt screen. Just one flick up and you're ready to go. With the XT4 screen, you've got to get your thumb or forefinger in this little slot, open to the left side, then tilt. On top of that, I feel the need to be a little bit more gentle when flipping the screen out. It's probably not a real issue, but I don't trust myself yet to not break it or pull it back at a weird angle and get it out of alignment. Also, you've got to consider if you already started to use swipe functions for your XT3 or other XT camera. That's something that has changed with the fully articulating flip screen. One function I really like to assign is the playback function, and I just swipe up with my right thumb. But look on the XT4, what if I'm shooting and want to engage whatever function I have for those swipes? Here I'm supporting the lens with my left hand and now want to swipe for a function. I have to take my hand off, reposition, swipe, and then go back no matter which thumb I'll be using to swipe with. And that is a speed issue, again a minor issue, but something that might add up as an experience overall. Also, do you use an L bracket for your vertical shots? I haven't seen the L bracket yet for the XT4, but I have used one on the Olympus EM1 Mark II, which also has a flip screen, and while it was workable, it certainly was awkward to use and didn't have full access to the rotation of the screen, as the L brackets are more fit to work with tilt screens. So let's say you go from shooting on a tripod to wanting to shoot handheld, you'll have to remove that L bracket for full rotation of the flip screen, which is another inconvenience. You know, overall, I really do like the flip screen. I like the angles that you can get with it and how easy it is to get to those angles versus the tilt screen. But again, if you're someone like me that does enjoy the speed of the tilt screen, I did want to make sure that you did think about that before you decided moving from the XT3 versus the XT4. Okay, now let's go over some of the differences that kind of stuck out to me when I started playing with the menu settings on the XT4 and how they differ from the XT3. The Q menu is now customizable regarding the number of items that appear when you hit the Q button. On the XT3, you were forced to have 16 items for the Q menu, but on the XT4, you now have the option to reduce it to 12, 8, or 4 items for a more minimal and clean look to your Q menu. I think this was already available on the X Pro 3 as well. Here's another useful new setting feature. The self-timer setting is now savable if you want it. On the XT3, when you're using the self-timer, let's say you start in one spot of the landscape and decide to change spots to move your composition. A habit of mine is to turn the camera off while trekking to the new location, but when I turn the camera to start shooting again, the camera forgets that I was previously shooting with the 2-second timer and forces me to pull it up again and set it if I want to use it. So again, a seemingly small hassle, but now with the XT4, we have the option to have the camera remember that setting. So when we turn it off and back on again, the camera now remembers that self-timer setting, cutting down on some of the hassle of resetting the timer out in the field. One more landscape applicable feature is the new setting for focus bracketing. I'll cover this in a separate video, but there is now an auto feature that lets the camera decide how many frames to shoot instead of you trying to decide and calculate yourself, and this cuts down on trial and error. Basically, you pick the near point of focus and the far point, and the camera takes care of the rest. Another new thing I noticed when going through the menu is the new settings for the auto white balance. We now have auto white priority and auto ambiance priority. I'll normally just set the white balance manually for landscapes, but auto white balance can work fairly well for shooting on the fly. After reading the manual, supposedly the white priority will give you whiter whites in a scene that is lit by incandescent bulbs. In the same scene, the auto ambiance is supposed to prioritize a warmer tone. Sticking with the color and tone of your images, we move to the Fujifilm film simulations. We have, for some, the highly sought after classic negative, which is somewhat of a high contrast retro looking tone that adds greens to the shadows. And now we have Eterna Bleach Bypass 2, which gives a bit of a muted saturation look. Both of them I can see working well in the right situation, but of course it's not going to be for everyone. You know, as I'm writing the notes for this video, I'm noticing that it's starting to get a little bit long, so if you've made it this far, thanks for hanging in there with me. We're going to now move on to the video features of the Fujifilm X-T4. Video is something I don't really shoot too much, so I did want to bring that up again. Again, I'm mainly a landscape shooter, just starting to dabble into video, so take anything I say about video with a grain of salt. So with that said, let's go over some of the changes that have been made to the settings of the X-T4 regarding video, some of the new features that you can set, and then we'll go over the IBIS as well. Let's start with the new codec. In addition to the H.265 and H.264 codecs, which were already on the X-T3, the X-T4 has now added the MP4 H.264 as another alternative for you on the codecs. For slow-mo lovers out there, you now have 240p with a 1.29 times crop factor in Full HD. You can now save custom settings for your film simulations when shooting video. Before, these settings were only available to save when shooting stills, but now you can save up to 7 different settings, changing tone curve, color, sharpness, dynamic range, etc. Very nice feature to have. Something I want to touch on real quick that applies to the shadow and highlight settings that were found on the X-T3, they are now in a menu option called Tone Curve. Now that the tone curve shows you the actual curve, I thought at first this would be another thing I'd have to learn, but the function works the same as the XT3, where the minus number for the highlights will bring them down and a minus number for the shadows will bump them up. So for those that normally leave these settings at a minus setting to get a flatter Eterna profile, know that it works the same. Okay, moving on to probably the biggest change in the XT4 from the XT3, and that is the IBIS, or the in-body image stabilization. For someone that does a lot of landscape photography, mainly on a tripod, and doesn't really worry about stabilization because of that, I thought this would probably be a feature that, even though it's big, wouldn't really help me a lot. But, it's probably going to end up being the feature that's going to make me really want to consider this over an XT3. What I'll do for the IBIS is I'll select a few lenses for the XT4, I'll get them mounted on, and then I'll run a few different shots in a few different scenarios to see how the IBIS performs with these different lenses. Recently I became somewhat obsessed with trying to ditch the tripod and shooting everything handheld, and I wanted to test if the IBIS on the XT4 would make for a viable option to be able to do that. So to be able to ditch the tripod. Sometimes when you're shooting on the tripod, you feel tethered down and maybe limited as far as the composition and angles you can get, and shooting handheld would be very freeing. So if the XT4 can provide enough stabilization for those shots, then I might consider ditching my tripod. I doubt it, but let's see what we find with that. Here with the 50 to 140 at 140 millimeters, which is a 200 millimeter equivalent, I was able to get at best 1/4 of a second, which is actually pretty impressive since the 200mm equivalent means that I should at least be shooting at 1/200th of a second, and maybe even a little bit faster to be safe. So with the IBIS, that is actually very impressive to me at that long of a focal range. When I zoom out to 50mm, 1/10 of a second was fairly easy to get. You can see that the shorter the focal length is, the longer the exposure is that you can get away with. Now at 10mm, I was able to get 1/4 of a second fairly consistently. Probably not as consistently as I thought though. 1/4 of a second would be perfect for water motion in seascapes for my personal taste, but I'm not sure the IBIS gets me there consistently enough to ditch my tripod. At 18mm, I challenged myself to get the longest exposure that I could get, and 1 second was the best that I can do, which is actually pretty impressive. But that meant having to use the best technique, and in the real world, that's probably not going to be consistent enough for you to want to ditch your tripod. So just a few more tidbits that I'll cover quickly, because as I write this, it seems to be getting way too long for this single video. Maybe I'll run a few more tests for another video. The XT4 has the exact same sensor as the T3, the Pro 3, the XT30, and the X100V. I won't do an image quality test in this video, but I've seen another video from another YouTuber, and he found there was a difference in colors, so I'll probably check that out in another video. Autofocus speed seems to be snappier and improved. Also, the low light autofocus seems to work a bit better and is rated for up to -6 EV, whereas the XT3 is rated to -3 EV. I'm not going to do a comprehensive lab test on this, as I'm sure another user will probably cover that somewhere else. So with the new battery, again, it is a little bit bigger. I won't go into a comprehensive test on this, but I can tell you that just taking out the XT4 from the box and charging up the battery fully, and then playing with some of the menu settings, playing with the movie mode, playing with the stills, trying to take as many shots as I can tell you just messing around with the XT4 that it does seem to last a little bit longer. Almost forgot to do the funnest test, but here's the XT3 at 11 frames per second versus the XT4 at 15 frames per second. So at the time of filming this video, the XT4 with its new release is priced at $1699 versus the XT3, which is now priced at $1199 retail, US dollars. So you've got to ask yourself, is that $500 difference worth it for you? If you're trying to decide and you're still on the borderline, I think you need to ask yourself a few questions. First, are you any of the following? A hybrid shooter doing at least 30% or more handheld shooting for video, a vlogger shooting selfie style videos for more than 30% of your work, someone that needs the improved battery life for longer shoots or worries a lot about running out of juice with the XT3, you travel a lot, or when you can, you will travel a lot when you're able to, and bringing extra gear to stabilize your shots is just not realistic. Do you already shoot with a fully articulating flip screen and don't want to get rid of it? Or does the XT3's tilt screen annoy you enough that you really want the flip screen? Do you need a faster continuous shooting shutter speed? And ask yourself, have you pushed your XT3 in your most used way and still feel limited by the lack of IBIS, the short battery life, and the lack of the flip screen? If you answered yes to most of these or all of these, then I would say the XT4 is the way to go. I say 30% for some of the criteria, and obviously that's a very random number, but I do way less than that for video, and I still find myself very happy with the XT4's new features. I did have a little buyer's remorse for a second, and even though I'm not taking full advantage of all the new features, I can see them being more valuable the longer I keep this and the more I get into video. And there is the key word for anyone on the borderline. It's video. Most of you know that this is meant to be a hybrid shooter's camera and not a huge upgrade for still shooters. I knew this going in with my purchase, but it still helps to be reminded of this, especially if you are undecided and maybe suspect you're thinking about this camera because you just got a bad case of gas or gear acquisition syndrome. If you are absolutely not a video shooter whatsoever and are more than 90% sure you'll never be into video, then I think the answer is simple if you're trying to decide on these two cameras. It's the XT3 all the way. Yes, I can see how IBIS can help if you really have shaky hands, but if you are already fairly steady, I don't think it's going to be good enough if you want to ditch your tripod, especially photographers that mainly shoot landscape. Image quality should for the most part be identical, though I have heard colors might be a touch different. I haven't tested it myself, but with the price of the XT3 significantly lower than the XT4 right now, I think it's still a great value and you'll have some room left over to pick up a nice lens or other accessory. You know, in the end, you really just have to ask yourself what type of images you want to make or what type of moving images you want to make, and then pick the right tool from there. Sometimes it's going to be the XT3, sometimes it's going to be the XT4 for some people, so you do have to ask yourself what your specific needs are. Or you can just give into gas or gear acquisition syndrome and buy the newer camera, which is what I did. But no, seriously, pick the right tool for the job. Anyhow, that's all I have for this comparison. Thanks for sticking with me through this whole thing. Make sure to click subscribe and ring the notification bell for more photo tips, tricks, and camera gear reviews. Until next time, take care and have a good day.